Hello everyone, today we are going to do a Triumph of Surgery written by James Herriot. This is the second part of my video and this is from the book Footprints Without Feet. I hope in the first video you have come across all the important incidents that I have mentioned, and I had told you to go through the story and make a mind map of all the important incidents that has occurred in the story. Now, in the three main characters we all know, Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey, and Dr. James Herriot, who is the writer of the story as well as the veterinary doctor. Now, in this story, in the first page, I was really worried about Tricky this time. Now, I is the narrator, that is James Herriot, and he is very worried about Tricky. So, what happens in the first page is that Tricky is a pampered and overfed dog who's kept by Mrs. Pumphrey, who is the owner of the dog. One day the narrator, who is a veterinary surgeon, Mr. James Herriot, sees Mrs. Pumphrey strolling along the street with the dog. And he's shocked to see the appearance because he's bloated like a sausage. He's like a bloated sausage. Now with a leg at each corner, and his eyes are bloodshot. Bloated sausage means swollen. Sausage means it's non-vegetarian food, and his eyes are bloodshot. All the veins are seen. And rheumy, that means a watery discharge is coming out of his eyes, and his tongue was out. It was hanging loosely from his jaws. Now this is the appearance of Tricky. This is how he was appearing, and that is why James Herriot, the doctor, is quite worried. So Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. She quickly wanted to explain that what exactly had happened, and she explains to Mr. Herriot that the dog was looking weak and listless. Listless means without any energy for some time. So she thought that he must be suffering from malnutrition. And that is why she was giving him some little extra. Apart from his normal feed, she was giving him some little extras between meals also, so that it would build up his energy. So what was the extra diet that she was giving? She was giving some malt, that is a cereal, and cod liver oil, that is made of, cod means a name of a fish, and the oil is extracted from its liver, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. So nothing really much, she said. And then Mr. Herriot asks her whether she had cut down on sweet things given to Tricky. So she replies that she tried, but she failed. She says that in her opinion, that Tricky loves cream cakes and chocolate so much that she can't bear to refuse. She was so attached with Tricky that she could not refuse whatever Tricky's favorite things were, and that is why she kept on feeding Tricky. Now, he again asks if there was whether she was giving plenty of exercise, but then she says that he has little walks, and just because the gardener, this is another character in the story, Hodgkin, the gardener, who was down with lumbago. This is a lower muscular pain in the lower region, in the low back. So there has been no ring throwing also. So that means no exercise regime was there for Tricky. And that is why Tricky was getting fat day by day. And then I tried to sound severe. Now Mr. Herriot was quite upset. So he became very serious, and he says that he's upset to know that Tricky's heavy diet and there no exercise regime. So this is what she was doing with Tricky. So in desperation he asks her whether she is giving him plenty of exercise. So Mrs. Pumphrey replies that Tricky does a little walk now and does not play any game, and Mr. Herriot warns her that she must keep Tricky on a very strict diet, otherwise he will seriously fall ill, as there is no exercise regime. So Mr. Herriot watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. Tottering means he was moving in a woolen fabric coat, and he had many coats like that for cold weather as well as a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. His head was drooped down, bent down because of the strap that he was wearing. He was not able to hold himself properly. So I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So what happened? He was expecting a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. So he comes to know that Tricky has stopped eating and has frequent vomiting, bouts of vomiting. And this time what happened? He refused to eat his favorite food also. So what did he suggest? He suggested, what did he suggest? He suggested that Tricky should be hospitalized because there was no other way. Now this poor lady, Mrs. Pumphrey, who was quite attached to Tricky, was swooned, almost in a state of fainting. She was sure that he would pine. He would pine means he would miss, and if he did not see her every day. So now Tricky was ill and the doctor was understanding his state, and he wanted a proper treatment that could be given to Tricky, and this will only be done if Tricky is hospitalized. But Mrs. Pumphrey was quite sad with this decision of the doctor. So she wailed, she was wailing, she was crying, and the doctor marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Now he had to take him to the hospital. So Mrs. Pumphrey could not bear the thought of separation from Tricky for such a long time. So all her maids and other staff members, they started bringing the dog's day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, etc. so that the dog is comfortable, Tricky is comfortable in the hospital. So Dr. Harriet then drives out of the house with the dog in a hurry, so that Mrs. Pumphrey doesn't change her mind, and then when he turns around from the back view mirror, he notices that when he turned around, he could see that everybody was in tears. They were in tears. So he glanced down at the pathetic little animal, that is Tricky, who was gasping. This was the state now of Tricky. How was he? He was gasping. He was breathing heavily, and little effort he could make to wag his tail. So he says that you haven't a kick in you. You haven't any kick in you means no energy. But I think I know a cure for you. He was quite sure that he is going to treat Tricky. Now at the surgery, they reached the hospital, the clinic, where there were other dogs who surged around him. They all were moving around Tricky as well as the doctor, and Tricky looked down at the noisy pack of dogs with his dull eyes, and he lay motionless. So what did the other dogs do? They sniffed around him and find him dull. So what did they do? They started ignoring him. So what did the doctor do? He made up a bed for him in a warm box, and for 2 days he started giving him the treatment. This was the treatment that was given to Tricky. What was the treatment? For 2 days he did not give any food to him. He gave plenty of water. So at the end of the second day, he started to show some interest. So Dr. Harriet kept an eye on him. He kept an eye on Tricky. Now later, when Dr. Harriet opened the door, Tricky trotted. Tricky walked out and he was engulfed. He was engulfed by Joe. Engulfed means just surrounded by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. So after rolling him, the dogs moved off to the garden. They all inspected him and they all went to the garden. So this time, what did Tricky do? Tricky followed them. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. He was present at the feeding time, and he watched while Tristan the helper, he slopped the food into the bowls. He spilled the food into the bowls for the dogs, and there was a headlong rush. All the dogs came rushing, and speedily they started having their food. and he was watching Tricky all the time. So every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition. That means only little food will be left. So they all started having food very quickly so that nobody could eat their food. So when they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls. Now these are the changes. Here you can see the changes in Tricky. Changes in Tricky. The changes we can see in Tricky. That was visible. So next day and extra, what did he do? He walked around the shining bowls licking casually. Then what did he do, Dr. Harriet? He kept an extra bowl what was put out for him, and he was pleased to see him jostling his way. He was pushing himself. He wanted to walk towards that, and he walked his way. He walked towards that bowl. So from then onwards, he could see the progress in Tricky. There was a rapid progress in Tricky, and no medicinal treatment was given. Very important. No medicinal treatment was given to Tricky of any kind. So he ran about with dogs. He started enjoying their company. He discovered the joy of getting bowled over. So this was at the end of the second day when Tricky starts showing some interest in his surrounding. On the third day, he starts to whimper when he hears the other dogs in the yards, and these were the positive signs of his recovery. So soon Tricky becomes friendly with other dogs. Joe the greyhound, we came across Joe. Later that day, other dogs have their feeding bowls. Tricky licks the bowls, and they have had their fill. Next day, an extra bowl was placed for him, and he rushed fast to have it. So Dr. Harriet does not give him any medicinal treatment. We have not seen any medicine given to him or any surgery done on Tricky. But and yet Tricky rapidly improved himself. He started improving, showing the signs of improving, and he started running around with other dogs with great enthusiasm. Now, what happened? It was a temptation to keep. Now, what happened? Mrs. Pumphrey was quite concerned. So Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously. She was moving around in the background, and she was calling the doctor a dozen times. She called him so that she could know about Tricky. But the doctor, Dr. Harriet, he dodged. He dodged means he avoided the questions about his cushions were turned or not, and whether the coat was worn or not according to the weather. But he was able to say about Tricky that he was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. He was recovering. Convalescing means recovering. Now the word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumpkin. She was happy, and she thought that maybe he must be giving him treatment, and and to build up his strength. What did she do? She started sending things, eatables for Tricky, so that he could build up his strength. So what are the different things? The different things that she sent was a dozen eggs, 2 dozen a time, to build up his energy, and she also to build up his energy, and even bottles of wine and even brandy. So all these things were not given to Tricky. So what did Dr. Harriet do? Dr. Harriet and his partners, they all started having a feast, a ceremonial occasion. This was a ceremonial occasion for them. So in all these items were thankfully, although it was thankfully received by Dr. Harriet, but the staff members and the partners, they all started enjoying. And that is why he says that he wanted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest, because he was enjoying everything that was sent for him. As well as he knew that once Tricky reaches his own house, he won't be treated in the same way. So now what happened? He then calls Mrs. Pumphrey, and he tells that the little dog has recovered, and he was awaiting collection. He wanted her to come and to take Tricky away. So Mrs. Pumphrey, she came in a car in a gleaming black metal that drew up near the clinic, and the driver, the chauffeur, opened the door, and Mrs. Pumphrey was almost lost in the interior of the car. So her hands were tightly, because she was quite nervous, and she really, when she was trembling that what would happen to my dog, and she had not seen him for such a long time. So she says that, "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" Then he assures that yes, he is fine. So I will go and fetch him. So he goes and he brings Tricky. So he walks through the house and into the garden through the pack of dogs, mass of dogs, and who were hurtling, roaming here and there. And this was the golden little figure that is Tricky. And in 2 weeks, you can see this is very important. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard, muscled animal, a flexible, strong animal. And he was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in grey bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So what did he do? He carried the dog to the front, to the front of the house where the car was parked, and Mrs. Pumphrey was waiting to see Tricky. Now what happened? Now here we can see Tricky's reaction. Now Dr. Harriet brings the lively dog Tricky, who leaps into her arms. So this is the change she saw and the transformation she could see in Tricky. She's simply startled, she's simply shocked at the great transformation of her dog, of Tricky. So what does she do? She exclaims that this is a triumph of surgery. This is very important. Triumph of surgery. Why this is a triumph of surgery? This is a triumph of surgery because how is this title suited? It is suited to the situation where a greedy dog falls sick and is being over-pampered, overfed. As a result, he becomes fat and lazy. Then he seeks medical help, as she does not realize that Tricky's state was her own doing. Although she kept her as a pet and she was over-pampering and overfeeding, so she should understand that every animal, this was because of her over-indulgent ways that Tricky fell ill. So then Mrs. Pumphrey seeks medical help, as she does not realize that Tricky's state was her own doing, and she is frantic as she thinks something is drastically wrong with Tricky. So in spite of repeated warnings by the narrator, she has failed to give a healthy grooming to Tricky, and that is where she lacked. She did not give healthy grooming to Tricky. And she does not realize that pets need a disciplined lifestyle also like humans. So when Tricky recovers under the narrator's watchful eye, she thinks it is a triumph of surgery. So ironically, the doctor has used no medicine or surgery to cure the dog, and that is why Mrs. Pumphrey remarks that this is a triumph of surgery. Children, I hope you've understood the chapter, and there are these questions in the textbook that you have to do it in the notebook as homework. I have also given the word meanings according to the paragraphs in the story. You can underline the word meanings, write the meanings in your textbook in the chapter itself, so that whenever you go through the chapter, this will help you in understanding the chapter in a better way. Now this is the theme of the story. What is the theme? And how is it? It has much significance in his life. How does a rich lady pampers her dogs and makes him lazy and fat? Then I have given you the character sketch of all the 3 characters. After that, I have given the justification of the title, like I told you. Please go through each and every slide, which is very important. I have also given you 2 reference to context. You can do it as your homework in your notebook, and a few extra questions that these are practice questions. You can do it in your notebook, and this will help you. I hope you go through the story once, and it helps you in understanding in a better way. If there are any queries, you can put it in the WhatsApp. Thank you.